Have you ever tried to explain Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon to a friend, and then like 5 minutes in, you're both just completely lost? Yeah, it's a lot. But don't worry. Today we're going to untangle this entire massive timeline, from the very first dragons to the last kings, and we're going to do it in a way that actually makes sense.
I mean, seriously, the Children of the Forest, the Doom of Valyria, Robert's Rebellion, you practically need a PhD in Westerosi history just to follow along. But what if I told you that this entire epic story can actually be boiled down to a way simpler idea?
Okay, here's the secret. Just think of it as two different stories happening at the same time on two different continents. Over on one side of the world, you've got Essos. That's the land of dragons, magic, and ancient empires. And on the other side, you've got Westeros, the future home of the Seven Kingdoms. To get the whole picture, we've got to start where all the fire began, in Essos. So our story really kicks off thousands and thousands of years ago in Essos. This is the place that gives us the Targaryens, the Dothraki, and, of course, the one thing that will literally reshape the entire world: dragons.
Now, long before dragons were a thing, Essos had its own superpowers. You had this great empire of Dawn that lasted for so long it's basically a myth now. Then came the Giscari Empire, a real powerhouse that pretty much built its entire society on slavery. But while these massive empires were busy fighting and conquering, the real power, the thing that would change everything, wasn't being forged in a palace. It was about to be found by a bunch of shepherds in the last place anyone would think to look.
That's right. The most powerful weapon in the history of this world wasn't created by kings or armies. It was discovered by some humble Valyrian shepherds who just happened to stumble across dragon eggs near a chain of volcanoes. They figured out how to hatch them, how to tame them, and how to bond with them. It's pretty wild when you think about it. The biggest shift in power in history started with a lucky find. And once they had dragons, these shepherds became the Valyrian Freehold, a full-blown empire of dragon lords. They went from 0 to 100, real quick. They completely wiped out the mighty Giscari Empire, just burned it right off the map, and took over almost all of Essos. For centuries, nobody could touch them. They were the undisputed rulers of the known world.
Okay, so park that thought about the Dragon Empire for just a second, because while all of this fire and conquest was happening in Essos, a completely different and much colder story was unfolding across the sea in Westeros. Let's hit rewind and see what was going on over there.
So, way back in the day, Westeros wasn't home to humans. It belonged to these magical beings called the Children of the Forest and to giants. But around 12,000 years ago, the first humans, the first men, showed up from Essos. And right away they started cutting down these sacred weirwood trees that were really important to the children. Well, that kicked off a brutal war that lasted for 2,000 years.
The Children of the Forest were losing, badly, so they got desperate. And in a last-ditch effort, they captured one of the first men and used some seriously dark magic to turn him into a weapon of ice and death. The only problem? Their new weapon was, well, it was a little too good. It was pure winter, and it couldn't be controlled. It turned on them. And in that moment of desperation, they had just created the world's biggest nightmare, the very first White Walker. And that unleashed the Long Night, a winter that literally lasted for an entire generation, plunging the world into darkness. The White Walkers and their army of the dead just rolled across Westeros. It got so bad that the old enemies, the first men, the children, and the giants, had to team up just to fight for survival.
After a long, brutal fight, the living finally managed to push the dead all the way back to the coldest part of the north. And to make sure something like this could never, ever happen again, a legendary guy named Brandon the Builder created the Wall, a gigantic 700-foot-tall barrier of ice and magic. This was supposed to be it, the shield that would protect the world of men forever.
So for thousands of years, these two worlds just stayed separate. You had the fire of Valyria over in Essos and the ice of the White Walkers locked away in Westeros. But that was all about to change. This is the moment, right here, where our two stories, the story of fire and the story of ice, are finally going to crash into each other.
All right, so let's jump back over to Valyria. The Targaryens? They were just one of about 40 Dragon Lord families at the time, not even the most powerful. But then, a young Targaryen woman named Daenerys had a terrifying, prophetic dream. She saw Valyria being totally destroyed by fire and ash, and she begged her family to get out while they could.
And wouldn't you know it? She was right. Her dream came true. The very volcanoes that had created the dragons all erupted at once in a catastrophe called the Doom of Valyria. In one single day, the greatest empire on Earth was just gone, wiped off the map. The cities, the people, the magic, and almost every single dragon vanished.
And here's the absolute key to this whole story. Only one Dragon Lord family made it out alive, the Targaryens. Because they listened to Daenerys' dream, they had already packed up and moved to a little island off the coast of Westeros called Dragonstone. That move made them the very last dragon riders left in the world.
Fast forward about 100 years. A Targaryen named Aegon looks over at Westeros, sees all these petty kings fighting each other, and decides, you know what, I'm going to unite that place. So he, along with his 2 sister wives and their 3 dragons, launch an invasion. And the results were just staggering. 6 out of the 7 kingdoms conquered in only 2 years. That's the power of dragons.
So the Targaryens take the swords of all the kings they defeated, melt them down into the Iron Throne, and rule Westeros for nearly 300 years. But, as we're about to see, an empire that's built on fire has a funny way of eventually burning itself down.
And the downfall didn't come from some foreign enemy. No, the rot started from the inside. About 170 years before Game of Thrones starts, the Targaryen family tore itself apart over who should inherit the throne. This sparked an absolutely brutal civil war. And if that sounds familiar, it should. This war, the Dance of the Dragons, is the entire plot of House of the Dragon.
The dance was a complete catastrophe. Targaryens fought Targaryens, and dragons fought dragons. They basically drove their own source of power to extinction. I mean, just look at the decline. They went from having total absolute power with a sky full of dragons to being overthrown with 0. Their greatest weapon was just gone.
The final nail in the coffin comes a couple centuries later. The crown prince, Rhaegar Targaryen, runs off with Lyanna Stark. The problem is, she was engaged to Robert Baratheon. When her father and brother go to King's Landing to demand her return, the Mad King Aerys Targaryen has them both killed in the most horrific way imaginable. And that one act of pure cruelty was the spark that lit the fuse for a massive rebellion, led by Robert Baratheon and his best friend, Ned Stark.
This time, without any dragons to save them, the Targaryens were just another army, and they lost. The Mad King was killed, their forces were defeated, and just like that, the Targaryen dynasty was over. Robert Baratheon takes the Iron Throne, and a new king sits in Westeros.
And all of that history leads us right to the very first episode of Game of Thrones. And suddenly it all clicks, right? Daenerys is the Mad King's exiled daughter. Jon Snow is the secret son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. His birth is the reason the whole war started. And the Iron Throne is now held by King Robert, a guy who took it by force, not by blood.
So when the show starts, the entire world is basically a powder keg, just waiting to explode. You've got the last Targaryens across the sea, plotting their comeback. You have a new Baratheon king who's on shaky ground. You have the loyal Starks in the north, and you've got the rich and powerful Lannisters pulling all the strings. It's an incredibly fragile piece that's about to be shattered.
When you look at the whole picture, from those shepherds finding dragon eggs to a rebellion that toppled an empire, you see this incredible cycle of power being found, being lost, and then being fought over again. It really makes you wonder, as we watch all these characters play the Game of Thrones, are they actually making any new moves? Or are they all just destined to repeat the same mistakes over and over again?